The following haunting is considered to be one of the most famous ghost stories during World War I, where there were so many credible witnesses that it was even investigated by the British government. Lieutenant Desmond Lucius Studdert P.P. Arthur was born on the 31st of March 1884 at O'Brien's Bridge in County Clare, Ireland, and came from a prominent County Clare family. Arthur was educated at Pretoria Royal School in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. From a young age, he had an adventurous spirit, and as he got older, he loved fast cars, where he won a number of prizes in speed trials. In 1908, he became a lieutenant in the Army Motor Reserve. However, Arthur was not only interested in vehicles on the ground, but also took a keen interest in flying, which at that time was in its infancy. His enthusiasm was such that he attended the very first Irish Aviation meeting at Leopardstown Racecourse in Dublin on the 29th of August 1910. It was at that meeting that he met a man called Cecil Grace, aged 30, who was a pioneer aviator. It was meeting Cecil Grace that inspired Arthur to become a pilot. Unfortunately, just 4 months after that meeting, Cecil Grace went missing on a flight across the English Channel on the 22nd of December 1910. From that moment, things moved extremely fast for Arthur, where on the 27th of May 1911, he joined the 5th Battalion Royal Munster Fusiliers Special Reserve and was promoted to lieutenant. It was there that Arthur became known for his adventurous nature, modest manner and high spirits. Barely a year later, on the 18th of June 1912, he gained his Royal Aero Club certificate after successfully completing his trials flying a Bristol Prier monoplane at Brooklands Aerodrome in Surrey, UK. On the 17th of April 1913, he joined the No. 2 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps. The squadron was based at Montrose Airfield in Scotland and was the operational base for the training of pilots for the Royal Flying Corps and was the first of its kind in the UK. Like many training schools, there were frequent crashes, but it was here that pilots were trained for both World War I and World War II. On Tuesday the 27th of May 1913 at around 7:30 a.m, Lieutenant Arthur took to the air in a BE-2-205 biplane, but disaster struck when it collapsed without warning while flying over Montrose while undertaking a routine practice flight from Upper Dysart to Lunham Bay. While Arthur had started his descent, suddenly, at 2,500 feet, the right wing of the aircraft snapped off and it plunged to the ground, taking the life of the young lieutenant. He was thrown from the aircraft and died instantly, breaking nearly every bone in his body, and was found 160 yards away from the machine. His fellow airmen were surprised by the crash, as they considered him to be a capable pilot. On the 21st of June 1913, the Accidents and Investigation Committee of the Royal Aero Club reported that the accident had been caused by a faulty repair of a broken spar by an unknown mechanic, and that damage to the aircraft had been caused by shoddy workmanship. It is in this location that our ghost story begins. It was a few months after Lieutenant Arthur's tragic accident on the 1st of January 1914 when the squadron moved from Upper Dysart to Broomfield Farm, and a Major Cyril Foggin saw a ghostly figure enter the officers' mess. However, he did not report it, firm that his reputation would be damaged and that he could be demoted or worse, be forced out of the services. But he was not the only person to witness ghostly apparitions, as there were further sightings by other officers and flight instructors. It appeared that all of the sightings were coming from the old mess of the No. 2 Flying Squadron. The sightings had become so frequent that the area became known as the Irish Apparition or the Montrose Ghost. Judging by the many descriptions given of the ghost, there appeared to be no doubt that they were seeing Lieutenant Arthur's apparition. His entity had become so common that guards were starting to desert their posts and pilots were so spooked that they were requesting transfers out of Montrose. Other men began reporting mysterious footsteps and phantom plane noises. One pilot claimed he saw a fellow soldier in flight gear walk to the door of their mess hall, only to disappear without entering, while a flight instructor said he woke up in the middle of the night and saw a pilot sitting in a chair by his bed. Another man, who had known Arthur, said that Arthur appeared to his room and tried to speak to him, but that the entity couldn't make any sound. The stories became so infamous that supposedly a German pilot who was shot down and captured behind Allied lines asked what the latest news on the ghost was. Because of these sightings, superstitious pilots started thinking there was something keeping Arthur from moving on. A close friend of Lieutenant Arthur was C.C. Gray, who claimed that his appearance was linked to the official investigation into the crash. During World War I, another investigative report was published at the end of 1916 that totally exonerated Lieutenant Arthur and restored his reputation, finding that the crash was due to a damaged wing. This was the original unofficial diagnosis. After the findings, Arthur made another appearance on the 17th of January 1917, which many believed would be his last haunting, that his spirit could at last move on, knowing that it had been vindicated. However, that was not to be, when he made another appearance 23 years later in 1940 when Britain was involved in World War II. A Hurricane pilot claimed that he was distracted by a mysterious World War I biplane while searching for a German Heinkel bomber. Whether this plane was an omen in some way is not known, or maybe Lieutenant Arthur felt that making an appearance would help the pilot's morale. In 1942, a flight lieutenant stationed at Montrose crashed into the runway not long after takeoff and lost his life immediately. Apparently, a week before the crash, he'd been seen quarrelling with a mechanic who had been working on his plane. The mechanic then became the subject of an inquiry in the belief he may have tampered with the plane, causing it to crash. But no evidence was found, although it was mentioned that shortly after the crash there were reports of a ghost appearing at the airfield wearing a flying suit and goggles. In a classic ghostly scene, the pilot was described as walking along the flight line emerging from a fog. Did Lieutenant Arthur make an appearance to guide the deceased pilot? By 1949, Montrose was now a permanent training station with a constant stream of new recruits who were all duly warned about the ghost. Lieutenant Arthur never failed to disappoint, in that there were dozens of sightings of an officer in a white flight suit with a hat and goggles. The sightings continued until the airfield closed in the 1950s. Then, on the 27th of May 1963, Sir Peter Masefield was flying his Chipmunk monoplane close to the old Montrose Air Base when he spotted an old BE-2 biplane. He described the pilot as wearing a leather flying helmet with goggles and a flying scarf, not in any way believing he was seeing an apparition. He watched in shock as the plane crashed. Masefield then landed his plane expecting to find the wreckage, but found no sign of a plane or its wreckage. Lieutenant Arthur's fatal air crash was one of the first to occur in the Royal Flying Corps and the first at Montrose. He was buried in Sleepy Hillock Cemetery, Montrose. Lieutenant Arthur was honoured with a wreath-laying ceremony on the 100th anniversary of his deadly accident. Whether that was the last people would see of his ghost is another thing altogether. The following is an extract that was taken from the Leslie Flint Trust, where a man by the name of Private Alf Pritchard of the 225th Machine Gun Corps Infantry was killed during World War I. The medium was Leslie Flint, and the spirit of Alf Pritchard was interviewed by George Woods and Betty Green. Alf Pritchard describes what it was like when he lost his life as a soldier in the First World War, and the initial question was asked by Betty Green, who asked Alf Pritchard what his reactions were when he found himself on the other side. Pritchard: One moment I was alive and I always remember it so well. We've been under heavy bombardment practically all day, and I thought to myself at the time, if we come through this lot, we'll be lucky, and then when we were early morning, we were given the command to go over the top. Well, I thought, this is it, boy. Oh well, if I come out of this lot, I'll be bloody lucky. Anyway, I went. I must admit that it took all I'd got to really get myself over the top. Anyway, I don't like even going into it, except in that all I know is that I was running forward, and I still kept running forward. And the funny part about it, that some of the Germans were coming towards me, and they rushed past me as if they didn't see me. I thought, well, that's a funny how do you do. All I remember was feeling in a pretty bad state, sweating and crying out loud, this is it, But instead of them attacking me or in any way, sort of taking any interest in me, they were rushing past me. I thought, well, good Lord, I can't make this out at all. And it took me quite a while to sort of realise what had happened. In fact, it was some time, I think, before I realised what had happened. I went on, and all I can remember is running and running, and I thought, well, if they're not going to see me, I'm certainly not going to bother about them. I'm going to try and get into a little cubby hole somewhere and get out of it. And all I remember is getting into a hole in the ground that had been created by a bomb, I expect, at some time. Anyway, all I know is that I got into this hole and just crouched down and thought, well, I'll wait till this shindig's over and hope for the best. Might get taken prisoner. Who knows? I don't. And I was lying there thinking to myself, well, it's a funny how'd you do. They didn't see me. They must have seen me, yet they went right past me. And I started to think about it, and I thought, well, I don't know. I'm lucky. And I don't know how long I must have been there. Anyway, I must have fallen asleep or something, because the next thing I know was that, at the time I remember seeing a bright light in front of me. It was just as if I woke up and there was a very bright light. And I couldn't make this out at all, because it was the sort of light I'd never seen before. It was just as if the whole place was illuminated, and it was so dazzling that for a moment I could sort of hardly look at it. I had to keep sort of closing my eyes and having a look. And I thought, well, I don't know, some sort of trick of the light or something. I got a little windy, you know. I didn't know what to think. Then all of a sudden it was just as if I saw an outline, a shape or figure appear. And I kept looking, and I thought, well, I don't know. I wasn't sure whether it was human or what it was. It was the outline of a human being, and it was full of luminosity, and gradually it seemed to take shape. And I was in an absolute sweat, because eventually I could see that it was an old friend of mine who I knew had been killed some months before, named Smart. Billy Smart, we used to call him. Old Bill. And he was looking at me and I was looking at him, and it was, I don't know how to explain this, it was as if somehow there was some sort of merging, I suppose in some way or other, of him and me. Most peculiar. I can't explain this. Anyway, all I know is that I felt myself getting up, and that struck me as odd that I should be conscious of myself getting up. In a strange sort of way I thought, well, here's me been lying here probably all night, all day and night. I ought to be feeling stiff and awkward and uncomfortable. But I didn't. I felt as light as a feather, and I thought, well, something's gone to me head. Perhaps I got a whack, or something. I didn't know what to think about it. Anyway, I went towards him, as if I was being drawn like a magnet to him. And as I got closer, I could see that he was, I don't know, full of vitality, full of life, wonderful, sort of colour in his face. And then, all of a sudden, as I got near to him, it dawned on me that he was dead. Funny thing was, when I first saw him, I didn't think of him as being dead, although I must have remembered and realised in a way he'd been killed some months before. Anyway, all I know is I was drawn to him, and he smiled at me, and I suppose I must have smiled back. Anyway, he sort of held out his hand, and I felt a bit of a daft in a way, because I know it's natural to shake hands, but there was me in a dug hole, a trench, a dugout, whatever you want to call it, crater in the earth, sort of shaking hands with someone who was dead. And it sort of put me in a cold sweat, in a kind of way. And I thought, well, what's going on here? I must be dreaming or something. Anyway, I could hear him speak, and he says, all right, nothing to worry about. You're all right, mate. Come on. And there was me putting my hand in his, just like a kid. And I thought, well, this is damn daft, this is. There's something wrong somewhere. Anyway, all I know is I got hold of his hand and suddenly felt a sort of floating sensation. And before I knew it, where I was, it was just as if I was being lifted up in the air, holding his hand too. And I thought, well, this is something, this is. It reminded me of something I saw years ago. Peter Pan or something. There was me, floating up in the air, holding his hand, and I thought, crying out loud, this is a funny dream, this is. There was us, sort of floating. I can't say I was doing anything else but floating, just with my feet off the ground, going gradually higher and higher, as if everything gradually was getting further and further away. And I could see in the distance, down below, the battlefield, and I could see the guns and the light and the explosions, and the war were obviously still going on. And I thought, well, I don't know. This is the most peculiar dream, this is. And then the next thing I remember was sort of gradually coming inside of what appeared to me to be a big city. It was luminous. That's the only way I can describe this. It's that it was luminous. It was as if all the buildings sort of had a glow about them. This glow, by the way, seemed to be something that seemed to be not only with him, my friend, but with everything. Even when I remember now looking back, there was a sort of haze or a glow over everything. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I suddenly felt my feet touching the ground again. Most peculiar. And it felt solid. And I remember walking along what appeared to be a long avenue. And on each side of this street or avenue were beautiful trees, and between every other tree or so there was what appeared to be a sort of statue. That's the only way I can describe it. Figures. Beautiful figures they were. Sculptured sort of figures, you see. And on the sidewalk, I suppose what you'd call it, or the path or pavement, people were going about, but dressed in most peculiar sort of dress. I thought, oh dear, this is a real corker. This is, a real dream. They looked like as if they might have been Romans or Greeks or something, like you see in pictures. And a beautiful building with pillars and beautiful steps leading up, some of them had. And they were mostly flat roof, by the way. I don't remember ever seeing any roofs and gables like one associated with England, for instance. They always seemed to be what you call on the continental side, sort of beautiful flat roof houses, beautifully designed, and this sort of glow coming from them. All sorts of people there was, and I saw horses. I saw several people on horseback riding beautiful, magnificent looking horses they were. And anyway, I thought, this is quite a do, this is, And anyway, he was talking away to me. Of course, he says, of course, you know what happened to you? So I say, what's happened to me? I says, all I know is what's happened, what ain't happened. I am having a good time here. It's better than being down there, in that lot. I shall be sorry to wake up. He says, don't worry, you ain't gonna wake up. I says, what do you mean you ain't gonna wake up? Well, he says, you've had it, chum. I said, what do you mean, had it? So he says, you're dead. I said, don't be silly. How can I be dead? I'm here. I can see all what's going on around me. I can see you. But I said, I know as though you died some months ago. You got a packet. But how is it that, I don't know. I said to him, you may be dead, but I'm dreaming. Ah, he says, no you ain't. You really are dead. You got a packet in that charge. I said, oh, get away. How can I have had it? I wouldn't be here like this, would I? He says, that's just it, he says. You are here. You're dead. I said, what? You don't mean to tell me this is heaven? So he says, well, not exactly, but it's an aspect. I thought to myself, aspect? What's aspect mean? And then suddenly it dawned on me that it was a sort of part of, Anyway, to cut a long story short, we went up to this nice, very pleasant road in this beautiful city, and we came to a sort of hill. Not a very steep hill. And right in front of me, on top of this hill, I could see what looked like a beautiful building. How can I describe it? Something I'd seen in the city of London, only much more white and much more beautiful. And I thought, this is a nice looking place. What's that? So I said to him, what's that place? And he says, you'll go in there, he says, to meet some of your old friends. He said, that's what we call a reception station. I said, oh, what? He said, it's like a kind of hospital. I said, well, I don't want to go to any hospital. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm all right, I said. In any case, I can't get this at all. He said, don't worry. Just don't tax your brain, he says. Too much at the moment. It'll come to you later. Just relax and enjoy yourself. I said, well, I'm doing that all right. It's a darn sight better than being down there. In a sense, I says, I don't particularly want to wake up. If this is what you say true, I have to believe you, but at the same time, I can't make head or tail of it. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we got to this place, and went in, and there was all sorts of people there, all kinds. But what struck me as odd, they were dressed much the same as, many people that I'd known, and what I used to dress like myself in Civvy Street, suits and that sort of thing. and it all seemed to be very natural. And the funny thing was that the outside of this place looked like a sort of temple place or something, I suppose you'd call it, but inside it all looked very natural, most peculiar. It was not exactly like an hospital, but at the same time it had an atmosphere of peace and tranquility and all that. Private A. Pritchett 9023 is listed as being killed on August the 16th, 1917, and is buried a mile from Ypres in the Bijitsi Lawn Cemetery in Belgium. The spirit assisting him was Private William Smart, 20394, of the 1st Machine Gun Corps Infantry, who died on February the 23rd, 1916, and is buried at Alice Memorial, Calais in France. Private Smart was killed 18 months before Private Pritchett.